Alex Haley was a writer whose works of historical fiction and reportage depicted generations of African American lives. He is widely known for Roots and the autobiography of Malcolm X. Who was Alex Haley? Alex Haley served in the U.S. Coast Guard for 2 decades before pursuing a career as a writer. He eventually helmed a series of interviews for magazines and later co authored the autobiography of Malcolm X. The following decade, Haley made history with his book Roots, which chronicled his family line from Gambia to the enslaved holding South. The Pulitzer Prize winning book was turned into a 1977 miniseries that became one of the most popular TV shows of all time. In 1939, Haley joined the Coast Guard. Although he enlisted as a seaman, he was made to toil in the glorious role of mess attendant. To relieve his boredom while on the ship, Haley bought a portable typewriter and typed out love letters for his less articulate friends. He also wrote short stories and articles and sent them to magazines and publishers back in the U.S. Although he received mostly rejection letters in return, a handful of his stories were published, and that encouraged Haley to keep writing. At the conclusion of World War II, the Coast Guard permitted Haley to transfer into the field of journalism. By 1949, he had achieved the rank of first-class petty officer in the rate of journalism. Haley was soon promoted to chief journalist of the Coast Guard, a rank he held until his retirement in 1959 after 20 years of service. Haley ultimately received a number of military honors, including the American Defense Service Medal, World War II Victory Medal, and an honorary degree from the Coast Guard Academy. A Coast Guard cutter was also named in the journalist's honor, the USCGC Alex Haley. Upon returning from the Coast Guard in 1959, Haley set out to make it as a freelance writer. Although he published many articles during these years, the pay was barely enough to make ends meet. In 1962, Haley got his big break when an interview he conducted with famous trumpeter Miles Davis was published. Later, he interviewed such prominent African American figures as Martin Luther King Jr., Sammy Davis Jr., Quincy Jones, and Malcolm X. After concluding his 1963 interview with Malcolm X, Haley asked the civil rights leader if he could write a book on his life. The result, 2 years later, was the autobiography of Malcolm X, a seminal book of the civil rights movement as well as an international bestseller. The project memorialized for eternity the life of Malcolm X, who was murdered before the book was finished, while transforming Haley, his collaborator, into a celebrated writer. In the aftermath of the book, writing and lecturing offers for Haley began pouring in and could have easily lived out his lifelong dream of being a successful independent scribe. Instead, Haley embarked on a hugely ambitious new project to trace and retell the story of his ancestors' journey from Africa to America as enslaved people, and then their rise from slavery to freedom. During a decade of research on 3 continents, Haley examined enslaved ship records at archives in the U.S. and England and traveled to Gambia, the believed home of his ancestors in West Africa. He recalled in a 1977 Ebony magazine interview, "I asked myself, what right had I to be sitting in a carpeted high-rise apartment writing about what it was like in the hold of a slave ship?" In an attempt to answer the question, he booked a passage on a ship from Liberia to America and spent his nights lying on a board in the hold of a ship in nothing but his underwear. When Haley finally published Roots in 1976, in what would be seen as part fictionalized story, part richly detailed historical account, the book caused a national sensation and went on to sell millions of copies. Roots, which spawned the enduring trend of consecutive night miniseries, starred an array of luminaries that included LeVar Burton, John Amos, Maya Angelou, Ed Asner, Sandy Duncan, Lou Gossett Jr., George Hamilton, Carolyn Jones, Robert Reed, Madge Sinclair, Cicely Tyson, Leslie Uggams, and Ben Vereen. A plethora of U.S. cities declared January 23rd through 30th, the week the programming aired, to be Roots Week. Haley died of a heart attack on February 10th, 1992 in Seattle, Washington at the age of 70. The author is credited with inspiring a national interest in genealogy and contributing a larger awareness to the horrors of racism and slavery and their place in American history.